our psychological experience. So, for example, if I want to study the phenomenon of how to uh, win friends and influence people, how to make friends. There we go. I want to study it from a biological perspective. So I'm going to look at things like our body, maybe, right? Our body chemistry specifically, maybe our anxiety, our adrenaline. I want to look at people's adrenaline levels. Maybe I can measure their sweat or their per, respiration. Respiration. I, yeah, I'm blocking on it, but let's just say sweat. That'll be easy. Heart rate, of course, is all those that can be indicators of looking at friendship. Of course, we're going to look at our brains, right? Our body and brain. We're going to look at the neurotransmitters, such as the release of dopamine, serotonin, even acetylcholine, and maybe even oxytocin. So those are kind of related to our pleasure centers. So we're going to look at things that release pleasure or makes us feel good from a biological perspective. So people who have maybe higher rates of anxiety, they are going to be less likely to maybe go and talk to strangers, and we can say that their friends or their number of their friends might be lower as a result of a different biological makeup than someone who gets a lot of reward, a lot of dopamine release whenever they're talking to strangers. So someone who's more extroverted. Right. Let's go on to our behavioral perspective. So these individuals look at the behaviors. So we don't really pay attention to the bio part of it. We don't really pay attention to the cognitive part of it. We're going to just pay attention to the behavior, right? Specifically reinforcement. So the learning chapter, right? So we're going to look at a behavioral perspective here, and we're going to look at reinforcement. So did the individual get reinforced for making friends? You know, what kind of reinforcement do you get? Is it rewarding or not? Was it positive reinforcement, right? So if there's talk about reinforcement, positive, negative, we're going to assume that the researcher is taking a behavioral perspective. There's also classic conditioning. So this might be your general feelings around making a friend based on previous experience, right? So maybe the first friendship that you made is still your best friend, and that you generally have warm feelings about talking to people because those encounters have been generally warm. And the opposite could be true, where your first encounter was really bad, and then that kind of scarred you for life. That'll be a form of classic conditioning. And then we have observational learning. So that's another form here for the behavioral. Maybe you learn how to make friends by watching your older siblings make friends or watching your parents talk to strangers, and you observe the right models to develop to exhibit in your behavior, and that increases the number of friends you make. Our next perspective is the cognitive perspective. This was kind of a mix of the memory chapter. It was mixed with the intelligence and language chapter. So it's kind of highlighted here and there. So the cognitive perspective focuses on our mental processes, what's going on in our minds, right? So this really indicates that we have an awareness of how we may problem solve the issue of making friends. So problem solving strategies, so strategies around how to make friends, right? So strategies could be research, their interests and hobbies. So do you have the same interests and hobbies? If you don't, then maybe you want to learn more about it. Attention could be, what do we pay attention to? Maybe we're paying attention to indicators that they are friendly, that they will respond to us. So we kind of make a decision, a judgment on the likelihood of success. So that might motivate us to try or not try on that, right? Language is another issue, like how well we are in able to express ourselves, but also that could be an issue of conflict if we don't have a similar language with our friends. There's memory, of course. You may memorize people. You may recall that you've met them before somewhere, and that might increase your friendship. Like you might have seen them in a previous class, right? So these are all indicators of an approach that you could use. So I can make a prediction that says the number of friends is based on your ability to come up with strategies on how to make a new friend. If you come up with 10 strategies, you have a likelihood of having way more friends than someone who can only come up with one strategy. So focusing on the mind, the thoughts, the mental processes, there's a lot of logic and rationale with this perspective. Next one is the psychodynamic perspective. This is approached by, of course, Freud and his idea of the unconscious. So if you hear unconscious, that might be the answer for the perspective they're looking for. There's a lot of unconsciousness. There's a lot of things dealing with sexual desires, sexual experiences, repression, and childhood events. So this perspective looks at our deepest, darkest desires and memories, and they say we don't really have access to it. If there's mention of the id, the ego, or the superego, those might indicate to you that the scientist is using a psychodynamic perspective. So a simple breakdown of the psychodynamic perspective for making friends is maybe we have urges or desires on what these friendships are. So it could be all related to sexual desires. So we make friends of the opposite sex a lot for potential opportunities. Or we make friends with the same sex who have circles of opposite sex friends. So we're trying to get access to maybe, well, I should say opposite sex. I should say that's the sex that you're into or the gender that you're into. Early childhood experience, so that could be, again, if you had a lot of childhood friends, then you're likely to have more grown-up friends as you grow up. So that could be, if you didn't have that, then it kind of explains why you have a issue with making those connections as adults. And then always goes back to your parents. So, kind of the whole blame your parents kind of thing. If you had a horrible childhood and now you're not having a lot of circle of friends. Right. Boom, boom, boom. We are moving on to the humanistic perspective here. So humanistic perspective focuses on our ability to be self-driven, to have high self-esteem, to have positive feelings about ourselves. It's that very positive approach to psychology. It says if we provide people with unconditional positive regard, if you hear that term, it's going to be, the humanistic perspective, right? We need to be empathetic to others. We need to listen. We need to treat them well. We need to support them, and that kind of helps everybody to be better for themselves. There's also that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Remember that we start with basic needs, and we move to safety, and we move to family, and we move to intimacy, right? So we can look at a humanistic perspective that friends are made if you treat them fairly. You treat them with empathy. You have positive regard for them. You think they're great friends, and you're real with them. You're transparent, right? All that leads to a really strong friendship. And people who do have these best friends forever feel that they exhibit these behaviors. Maybe not fully unconditional positive regard, but definitely for the most part. And you can kind of see people who have these BFFs will probably have their physiological needs met, right? They have their food, shelter. They will have their safety needs met. They'll have their family. So a good relationships with your family, with your parents helps you to really form those more solid relationships with your friends. So you have a boost in self-esteem. And then you can lead to, being the best of who you are, the self-actualization. All right. Oops, going forward here. Our next perspective is the social cultural perspective. And this one really focuses on how society plays a role in our beliefs, our attitudes, who we're attracted to, right? Our social norms, customs, tradition, rules. So this one's pretty straightforward. If you hear mention of social influence or cultural influences, then you're probably going to answer social culture perspective. So culture defines And social norms defines when it is appropriate and how to approach making friends. So that could be anywhere, a playground, when you're younger, a park, people in the neighborhood. Those are all kind of cultural norms. As you get older, school generally is a place where you'll find friends, library, like that, the mall. As you get even older, maybe in the bars, in the clubs and things like that, adult activities, festivals, other things like that, and how to approach it. We have norms where you don't just run up and hug a stranger, right? That'll be like a social norm violation. Maybe in some places that's appropriate, but not here in America. It's usually you have to introduce yourself verbally to them and express that you want to be friends without saying those words. It's kind of a weird cultural norm we have. Last perspective is our evolutionary perspective. This one is about being hunter gatherers and developing our belief systems, our behaviors, our attitudes from that perspective past. It's all about survival and reproduction. So if you hear the term survival, reproduction, fitness, you can think of the evolutionary perspective. And the advantage of the evolutionary perspective is it explains a lot of our current behaviors in things that were adaptive in the past that may not be so adaptive now. So we talked about like eating behavior, right? The sugary, fatty foods, mate choice, how are supposed to prefer certain types of mates is kind of true now, where we prefer people who are healthier, younger, fitter um, for reproductive purposes. It talks about how we should support people that we're related to because of that genetic similarity. Friendships and cooperation increases our survival. Remember, we talked about studies where you're likely to live longer if you're married. So, parenting behaviors, keeping the kids safe, um, social organization, how our society is organized, what our society values, like resources, right? So let's apply the evolutionary perspective on friendship making. So friends keep you alive. Yeah, they provide mates because that's how we meet potential others through our friendship networks. You're more likely to trust people that you know and that are recommended by other people that you know by recommendation, right? What else? Yeah, evolution perspective. The kind of the reason why you need to make friends is eventual survival and reproduction, and that's pretty straightforward for that one. All right, so good luck on the final. Hopefully that helped to kind of apply some of these perspectives of psychology. And again, it's more about logic and reasoning. So you kind of have to be presented with a problem, and you kind of have to identify what perspective was used to approach that problem. And again, there were other videos on the final exam. So if that didn't help out, you can kind of play these other two videos that say it in a similar but different way.